75% of people who try to quit smoking relapse within the first week. The first week, they just go right back to it. That's how powerfully reinforcing the nicotine is. Remember, it's the nicotine in the cigarette that's powerfully reinforcing, but it's also the oral habit, the motor habit. You know, there is this thing about density of sensory receptors in the lips. People like bringing things to their lips. Food, cigarettes, other lips in some cases, etc. There is a reinforcement pathway related to that for sort of obvious adaptive reasons. And as a consequence, there is a reinforcement both from the behavior and from the dopamine released from the nicotine itself. And as I mentioned earlier, from the positive reinforcement that comes from increased focus. So the money that you make through work, or your attentional ability, or the fact that you're alert and people feel you present, all of that funnels back into positive reinforcement, behavioral reinforcement, and then what we would call addiction. Vaping is actually harder to quit than cigarette smoking for most people. Does that mean that cigarette smoking is fairly easy to quit for most people? No. 70% of people who smoke cigarettes report that they would like to quit if they thought they could. The success rate of quitting smoking when people try to go just cold turkey, just quit with no assistance whatsoever, they might tell their family and friends, hey, I'm quitting, that's it, is exceedingly low. It's 5%. So 5% of the people that say, that's it, I'm not smoking again, despite cancer diagnosis, I'm not smoking again, despite the fear of the negative health effects, I'm not going to ever smoke again, despite the financial cost, the health cost. I mean, I could list off a huge number of things that it does that are negative, but you already know these or you've heard them. It makes your skin worse. It, as I mentioned, it lowers libido. It disrupts hormones. It disrupts vascular function, brain function. It does all these terrible things, and yet most people who try and quit simply can't. And of the 5% that succeed in quitting, a full 65% of them relapse within a year. So that's a very depressing picture. But it's not to say that people cannot quit. In fact, they can. There are a couple of methods that have been shown to help people quit. Some are behavioral and some are pharmacologic. I just want to touch on the behavioral ones first, because it turns out that there's a quite powerful method for quitting nicotine ingestion by way of cigarette smoking, which also carries over to vaping. This is beautiful work that's been done by my colleague, in fact, close collaborator, although I was not involved in the research that I'm about to describe, at Stanford, and his name is Dr. David Spiegel. He is our Associate Chair of Psychiatry. He's been a guest on the Huberman Lab podcast, and he is a world expert, if not the world expert, in the clinical applications of hypnosis. Now, when I say hypnosis, a lot of people think stage hypnosis, which is the hypnotist trying to get people to do certain things and say certain things, not necessarily against their will, because they actually have to agree, but the hypnotist is dictating what the person thinks, says, and does. Clinical hypnosis is vastly different from that. Clinical hypnosis is where the person, the patient, actually directs their own brain changes toward a specific emotional or behavioral goal. Work from Dr. David Spiegel's laboratory, done in 1993, but that now has been repeated many, many times and has carried over into some more modern studies, and I'll provide links to those studies in the show note caption so that you can access them. Those studies have shown that using a specific form of hypnosis, people can achieve complete and total cessation of cigarette smoking, and there's no reason to believe this doesn't also carry over to vaping, through one single hypnosis session. And the success rates are incredibly high when one considers that normally it would be only a 5% success rate. The success rate with this particular hypnosis, developed at Stanford School of Medicine by Dr. David Spiegel, is 23% of people who do this hypnosis one time succeed in quitting smoking. Now, in the old days, which actually wasn't that long ago, before the advent of smartphones and before the internet took off to the extent that it has now, this was done by having someone come into the clinic, and Dr. Spiegel himself or one of his colleagues would take somebody through the hypnosis. Nowadays, you can access this hypnosis. There's a wonderful app that was developed by Dr. David Spiegel and others. It's called Reveri, R-E-V-E-R-I. I've talked about this app a few times on the podcast before because there are hypnosis scripts within the app for enhancing sleep, for improving ability to fall asleep if you wake up in the middle of the night, for focus, and a number of other behavioral and emotional changes. There's also a function in the Reveri app for smoking cessation, which exactly parallels the sort of in-laboratory and in-clinic approaches that Dr. Spiegel would use were you to show up at his clinic or in his laboratory. And since that's not possible for the large number of people out there, if you or somebody else is trying to quit smoking or vaping or dipping or snuffing for that matter, I strongly encourage you to check out the Reverie app. You can find it easily by going to reverie.com. It's available in various formats. Some of it is available free, some of it is behind a paywall. But given the tremendously negative impact of smoking, vaping, dipping, and snuffing, the hypnosis for smoking cessation that Reverie has seems, at least to me, as a very powerful and worthwhile resource. So please check that out if you're somebody who's trying to quit ingesting nicotine by any of the 4 methods that I just described. A very common approach for people to try and quit smoking or vaping is to use nicotine itself to try and prevent people from seeking nicotine through a cigarette or a vape pen. What I mean by that is people using a nicotine patch or nicotine gum or other nicotine delivery device that is not cigarettes and not vaping in order to maintain levels of nicotine in their bloodstream, which of course means maintain levels of nicotine in their brain and body to the same extent that they would if they were smoking or vaping, maybe even gradually taking down the total amount of nicotine in their brain and body by reducing the number or size of nicotine gum pieces that they ingest each day, or keeping the patch on for a shorter amount of time, or getting a lower dose patch that releases less nicotine total or over time. All of those approaches have been shown to be reasonably successful. I'll get to the numbers in a few minutes, but reasonably successful in allowing people to quit smoking or vaping.